Canada has been ripping us off for years on dairy products. We're going to charge the same thing they charge us, 250%. It is not fair, it never has been fair, and they've treated our farmers badly. That was Donald Trump in the Oval Office announcing what he thought would be his trump card against Canada. Reciprocal tariffs on agriculture, match Canada's dairy tariffs dollar for dollar, threaten their food exports, force them to the table. It was supposed to bring Canada to its knees. Instead, it triggered something Trump never saw coming, a complete restructuring of North American food trade that left American farmers watching helplessly as their second-largest export market simply walked away. This is the story of how Trump weaponized food and how Canada turned that weapon back on itself. How a threat meant to punish Canadian protectionism exposed the dangerous fragility of American agriculture and how millions of American farmers are now paying the price for a trade war they never wanted. But before we dive into this incredible story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Tonight, we're showing you how Canada found new buyers for everything Trump threatened to block, why American farmers are losing billions while Trump claims victory, and what happens when you turn food into a geopolitical weapon without understanding who actually holds the power. Let's start with the lie that has been repeated so many times. It has almost become accepted fact that Canada charges 250% tariffs on American dairy products, crippling us farmers and creating massive unfairness. Here is what Trump never mentions. Those tariffs only apply if U.S. exports exceed a predetermined quota. And as the U.S. dairy industry itself acknowledges, America isn't even close to hitting those quotas, not in any category. The International Dairy Foods Association sent calculations to fact checkers showing that at the end of last year, the average fill rate for dairy products was only 26.72%. In other words, American dairy exports to Canada face zero tariffs on 73% of potential volume that is not even being used. In practice, these tariffs are not actually paid by anyone, explained Al Mussel, an expert on Canadian agricultural trade. But Trump doesn't care about facts. He cares about rhetoric, so he kept raging about Canadian dairy tariffs, threatening reciprocal 250% tariffs, and using agriculture as a cudgel to beat Canada into submission. What Trump failed to understand is that threatening food exports doesn't just hurt the target country, it forces them to find alternatives. And once they find those alternatives, they don't come back. While Trump was threatening tariffs, Canadian agricultural strategists were doing the math, and the numbers were stark. 75% of Canadian food and beverage exports went to the United States. That dependence was a vulnerability Trump was exploiting. The solution wasn't to beg for mercy. The solution was to eliminate the vulnerability. Farm Credit Canada released a comprehensive analysis outlining a radical strategy: shift $12 billion of Canadian food and beverage exports away from the U.S. market. Not over decades, over the next several years. The plan was sophisticated and multi-layered. First, increase interprovincial trade, getting Canadian provinces to buy more from each other instead of importing from the U.S. That could account for $2.6 billion of the shift. Second, leverage Canada's existing 15 free trade agreements more effectively. Canada had deals with 51 countries representing 66% of global GDP, but was still primarily selling to just one, the United States. Third, and most ambitiously, actively pursue new markets in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. This could create $9.4 billion in new business, replacing American markets with partnerships that treated Canada as an equal rather than a subordinate. The opportunities were enormous. Prepared foods represented $8.6 billion in exports, with 90% going to the U.S. Vegetable oils, animal feed, meat products, all heavily dependent on American buyers, all ripe for diversification. But here is what made the strategy brilliant. It wasn't reactive. Canadian agricultural planners had been thinking about diversification for years. Trump's threats simply provided the political will and public support to actually execute it. The Canada, European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, had been in place since 2017, but Canadian agricultural exports to Europe had remained relatively modest. The infrastructure was there. The tariff elimination was there. What had been missing was the urgency. Trump provided that urgency. Within months of Trump's tariff threats, Canadian agricultural companies started aggressively pursuing European markets. CETA had already eliminated tariffs on 98% of Canadian goods entering the EU. Now Canadian exporters were determined to use that access. A Quebec dairy farmer reported that his sales to European markets had increased by 34% as major grocery chains committed to featuring Canadian products. People are asking specifically for Canadian milk, Canadian cheese, he explained. The quality reputation is opening doors we couldn't get through before. Canadian beef exports to Europe surged. Pork products found new buyers in Germany and Poland. Seafood, particularly from Canada's Atlantic provinces, started flowing to markets in Spain, Portugal, and Italy. The timing was perfect. Russia's war on Ukraine had shattered Europe's east-west trade pipeline in agricultural commodities. The conflict had upended long-held assumptions about food security on the continent and forced many countries to seek new reliable suppliers. Canada, with its reputation for quality, stability, and respect for trade rules, was exactly what Europe was looking for. And Canadian exporters, desperate to reduce dependence on the unpredictable American market, were eager to build these relationships. By the time Trump realized what was happening, Canadian agricultural companies had already signed multi-year supply contracts with European buyers. The infrastructure was being built, the relationships were solidifying, the pivot was becoming structural. But Europe was only part of the story. The real opportunity was Asia. Southeast and South Asia's global agriculture and food consumption is expected to grow to over 31% of global consumption within the next decade. Canada's Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTP, already provided preferential access to Japan, Australia, Vietnam, and 6 other Asia-Pacific nations representing over 500 million consumers. Canada was negotiating additional free trade agreements with ASEAN, India, and Indonesia. The infrastructure existed. What had been missing was the will to use it. Trump's threats provided that will. Canadian wheat exports to Indonesia increased dramatically. Peas and lentils found eager buyers in India. Canola, one of Canada's most important crops, started flowing to Asian markets that had previously been supplied by American competitors. In just months after Trump's most aggressive tariff threats, Canadian agricultural exports to Asia jumped by double digits in multiple categories. And here is what made it permanent. These weren't speculative exports or one-time deals. These were long-term partnerships being built on the foundation of Canada's reputation for reliability, something America under Trump could no longer claim. While Canada was signing new deals and opening new markets, American farmers were watching their second-largest export market evaporate. Canada is the second-largest destination for us agricultural products globally. Only Mexico buys more American farm goods. In a typical year, the U.S. exports $28 billion worth of agricultural products to Canada, but through the first 7 months of this year, agricultural exports to Canada were down 10%, and the decline was accelerating. American dairy farmers, the ones Trump claimed to be protecting, watched as Canadian buyers pivoted to European suppliers. The irony was cruel. Trump raged about Canadian tariffs that weren't actually being paid. And in response, Canada stopped buying American dairy altogether. American beef producers faced similar devastation. Canada had been a reliable buyer of US beef for decades. As tensions escalated, Canadian meat packers started looking elsewhere: Brazilian beef, Australian beef, Argentine beef. Once those relationships were established, once the supply chains were built, American ranchers weren't getting those customers back. The agriculture sector's pain extended beyond direct exports. American farms that supplied restaurants and food processors in border regions saw orders drop as Canadian consumers boycotted American products. And then there were the input costs. Canada is America's largest supplier of potash, the key ingredient in fertilizer that American farmers depend on. When Trump threatened 25% tariffs on potash, he was literally threatening to increase costs for the very farmers he claimed to be protecting. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins eventually had to beg Trump to reduce potash tariffs from 25 to 10% at the height of planting season. The fact that this was even necessary showed how little thought had gone into the tariff strategy. Trump's fundamental error was treating food as just another commodity to be weaponized in trade negotiations. But food isn't like steel or automobiles. Food is about security. Food is about survival. When you threaten a nation's food supply or their ability to export food, you force them to prioritize resilience over relationship. Canada learned this lesson and they applied it ruthlessly. The Be Canadian campaigns that swept the country weren't just about consumer products. They were about food security. Canadian grocery chains started prominently featuring domestic products. Government procurement policies prioritized Canadian suppliers. The psychological shift was complete. A poll found that 68% of Canadians were consciously avoiding American products, with that number climbing to 79% among Canadians under 40. This wasn't just anger, this was a generation deciding that food security couldn't depend on American reliability. Canadian farmers responded by expanding domestic production to meet this new demand. Fields that might have grown crops for export to the U.S. were now growing for the domestic market. Processing facilities that had relied on American buyers were retooling for Canadian and international customers. Meanwhile, Canadian agricultural exports were finding eager buyers around the world who were specifically looking for alternatives to American suppliers. The Trump administration's unpredictability, its willingness to weaponize trade, its casual threats against allies, all of this made other countries nervous about depending on American food exports. Canada became the beneficiary. Made in Canada became a selling point, not just for quality, but for reliability. Canadian exporters could tell buyers, "We won't threaten you with tariffs because our president is having a bad day. We honor our commitments. We're a stable partner." That message resonated and it translated into billions of dollars in new business that American farmers were losing. Here is what Trump's food trade war exposed. American agriculture is far more vulnerable to disruption than anyone realized. For decades, American farmers had operated under the comfortable assumption that Canadian buyers needed them more than they needed Canadian buyers, but those assumptions masked a critical weakness. American farmers had grown dependent on Canadian demand in specific categories where Canada had limited domestic alternatives. Once Canada found new suppliers or built domestic capacity, that demand didn't come back. Meanwhile, Canada exported products to America that were genuinely difficult to replace: potash for fertilizer, certain specialty grains, seafood. When Trump threatened these imports with tariffs, he wasn't just hurting Canada, he was threatening American agriculture's ability to function. The asymmetry was stunning. Trump thought he was wielding power. He was actually exposing weakness. Let's talk about who is actually paying the price for Trump's agricultural trade war. A dairy farmer in Wisconsin told reporters his income had dropped 40% since Trump started the tariff war with Canada. Canadian buyers who'd been purchasing his products for decades had switched to European suppliers. A corn farmer in Iowa watched futures prices collapse as China imposed retaliatory tariffs. He'd planted his entire crop based on price projections that assumed normal trade relations. Now, he was facing the possibility of selling at a loss. A rancher in Montana who'd supplied beef to Canadian buyers faced a similar crisis. Those buyers weren't coming back. They'd found Australian beef that was cheaper and came without the political complications. These aren't abstract economic statistics. These are people whose livelihoods depend on international trade relationships that Trump destroyed with a tweet. The damage isn't temporary, it is structural. Canadian buyers who've spent months building relationships with European, Asian, and Latin American suppliers aren't switching back just because Trump changes his mind. The supply chains are established, the contracts are signed. The infrastructure is built. A Canadian food processing company that used to import American corn now imports Brazilian corn. That company has invested in logistics, established quality standards, and built relationships with Brazilian suppliers. Even if American corn became cheaper tomorrow, switching back would mean abandoning those investments and risking those relationships. Canada is on track to achieve its goal of doubling non-US food exports within a decade. That is not just diversification. That is a fundamental restructuring of Canadian agriculture away from American dependence. Meanwhile, American farmers face a future where their second-largest export market has shrunk by double digits and shows no signs of recovery, where international buyers view American agricultural products as politically risky, where the reputation for reliability that took generations to build has been destroyed in less than 2 years. Food is power, but not in the way Trump thought. Trump believed that threatening food trade would give him leverage. What he didn't understand is that weaponizing food forces other countries to prioritize food security above economic efficiency. Canada looked at Trump's threats and concluded they couldn't afford to depend on American food imports or exports, so they built alternatives. And once those alternatives existed, American farmers lost not just market share, but market access. Trump thought he was demonstrating American strength. He was actually teaching the world how to survive without American agriculture. And that lesson, once learned, doesn't get unlearned. Trump threatened Canadian food exports, thinking it would bring them to heel. Instead, Canada took control of their own market, found new buyers around the world, and left American farmers to deal with the consequences. That empty warehouse in Iowa, waiting for Canadian orders that will never come again. That is Trump's real legacy to American agriculture, and every day those warehouses stay empty. American farmers understand a little more clearly who actually paid the price for this trade war.